Right. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone from which you're joining us. Welcome to this Missing Data and Inequities Summit. We're thrilled to have you with us today for an event in which we're going to be launching the next book in the NORRAG series on international education and development, and also discussing some of the key ideas that are coming out of that nearly 2-year project now. Last week there was a global event held at UNESCO, also discussing issues around data. This is something where we know it's a key issue for people working in education and development. And so we're very proud of the work that has been done in this particular area by NORRAG, and particularly the book that we'll be launching at the end of this webinar today. So we have a packed agenda for you. All of the speakers have promised to keep to time. And what we are going to do is start here with an editor's overview. So the two editors of this particular book, Marcos and Daniel. Then we have a discussant, Pali Lehohla from the Pan-African Institute for Evidence. We're very happy to have him with us again to discuss some of the key ideas coming out of this book. And then we have the two panels, and both of those panels will be introduced by Amita Chudgar. And then the first panel is looking at the regional chapters, and the second panel is looking at data and inequalities with a more thematic focus. And we're very grateful to our two moderators of those panels, Nelson and Anne, for being with us today. As you can see at the bottom, this event is co-organized by NORRAG and also the University of Sussex and Indiana University Bloomington, the two institutions of our editors. Very briefly, NORRAG is the Network for International Policies and Cooperation in Education and Training, serving an international community, which is a multi-stakeholder community. 50% of our over 5,000 members are based in the Global South. And moving on, please, Camille. You too can join the network. Just click on that QR code or follow the link which is being put into the chat function. So at NORRAG, we have 4 key strategic activities, and fundamentally the basis of everything that we do is surfacing underrepresented knowledge, particularly from the Global South, in order to be able to effectively broker policy dialogue, co-produce knowledge, and share and mutually strengthen capacities. And we do those things in order for our stakeholders to then be able to amplify that underrepresented knowledge and expertise in order to improve access, knowledge, and also action to contribute to making a world in which everyone can access quality education in an inclusive and equitable manner. We work in these 5 strategic themes. And as you can see from the color, the event today fits into our data and evidence theme, particularly as with all of NORRAG's work thinking about inclusion of marginalized groups. And so I'm thrilled to hand over to Marcos del Prato, who is Senior Lecturer at the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex, and Daniel Shepherd, who's Postdoctoral Fellow in International Sustainable Development at Indiana University Bloomington, for an overview of the book that we will be launching at the end of this event. Marcos, over to you first.
Okay, thank you, Moira. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this book launch event. We are very glad for your interest you have shown in the book. So next slide, please. So what's the motivation of the book? The book shows how a better implementation and monitoring of SDG4 framework can be achieved by holistically approaching different dimensions of inequality, particularly representing all marginalized groups, and also by improving the availability and quality of data. In turn, this can guide to a more robust, evidence-informed policy decision-making. The contribution of the book is also very timely, given the data gaps on key SDG4 indicators, which remain a major bottleneck to monitoring progress towards the deadline. Vitally, data gaps overlaps with marginalization. That's a key element throughout the book. Data gaps, or missing in our case, intersect more powerful among vulnerable populations and sector of educations. And these groups are the ones who need more close monitoring throughout. In that sense, addressing missing data is an opportunity to boost equity between and within those marginalized groups. The nature of the challenge can be both regional as well as thematics. That's, in a sense, why we structure the book that way. The books, in a nutshell, looks at the disconnection of data sources and barriers from the point of view of missing education data. Next slide, please, Camille. With regard to the structure, as you can see there, we can start saying essentially that throughout the book, we have two types of missing data, which could be practical, essentially data not being reported, or conceptual, when key dimensions are being ignored for the monitoring framework. The book, as you can see, is structured in two blocks. It has 8 chapters, plus the introduction and the conclusions. The logic is that we have a core chapter, which is chapter 2, and then we have regionals and thematic chapters. In the case of the chapter 2, which is the framework, throughout this chapter, which I did, identify data gaps by introducing a comprehensive conceptual framework, which include dimensions of education inequality that they are missing from the UAS data regime. The bottom line, I would say, that we're trying to go further from what is actually done by UAS, acknowledging how the different drivers change across the education life course, and also by the different type of regions and thematic challenges. After introducing the framework in chapter 2, we move into chapter 3 to 6, when we have regional challenges on monitoring from the point of view of missing data across different regions, which are Latin America, Asia, the Arab states, the Arab region, and Africa. When we look at data gaps in each of these regions, from the point of view of national, regional, and global monitoring needs from those regions. Then in chapter 7 and 8, we move into thematic chapters, and particularly the chapters that are about gender, internally displaced people, and indigenous groups. Because in that case, for the thematic chapters, we might have nuances regarding why different types of missing data occur within the UAS data framework, from the point of view of gender, indigenous marginalization, or IDPs. So I guess I'm time, so over to you, Daniel. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Marcos. While the chapters highlight important regional and thematic differences in terms of the gaps in education data systems, they also highlight a shared set of challenges, which I'll focus on during my short remarks. First, they highlight continued structural weaknesses in education data systems, and that in far too many instances, the SDG4 data regime is not fit to purpose in terms of its usefulness to support the policy and program changes that could improve educational equity. The combination of weak infrastructures and a lack of attention paid to data use continue to hinder progress on SDG4. Second, specific groups of learners continue to be systematically left out of education data systems, as Marcos mentioned, including data governance. These include groups who have been historically marginalized by political power structures, including those who are differently abled, female, non-citizens, and from indigenous peoples. These missing groups also include those who experience contemporary shocks of war, displacement, and economic collapse. Unfortunately, the patterns often confirm that it is the most marginalized who are the most likely to be left out of education data systems. Third, despite the breadth of the SDG4 targets and language around lifelong learning, the SDG4 data regime continues to reflect international development's historical prioritization of access to primary schooling delivered by the public sector. This contributes to a neglect for other educational levels, delivery systems, and outcomes. The underlying framework of the SDG4 data regime may also limit our ability to track important drivers of educational inequality and how they intersect across the life course. Next slide, please. Despite continued challenges, the book collectively points to opportunities for action that can address gaps in data production, governance, and use in order to improve education for all. First, there are increasing initiatives to prioritize regional, national, and sub-national data systems in a manner that aligns more closely with policy priorities. Initiatives by the African Union members to align indicators with continental and domestic priorities provides a case in point. The focus on cross-national monitoring among some international actors and comparative scholars may be distracting some of us from the important work of developing temporally and internally consistent national education data systems with better transparency as well, so that their populations can use the data to pressure for action and ensure accountability related to local policy priorities. Second, countries in every region are finding innovative ways to link within and beyond education data systems to inform education policies and practice. Promising examples include the use of individual level data to create early warning systems to reduce school dropouts in several countries in Latin America, among others. However, large gaps remain in terms of barriers to linking data systems across and beyond the education sector, particularly in terms of challenges to link across education levels and to include education delivered by private entities and civil society organizations. In addition, there remain technical, logistical, and legal barriers to linking administrative data, despite its increasing promotion for measuring SDG4 and other SDGs. Finally, there are promising initiatives that are improving the engagement with and use of education data. For example, there has been an expansion of citizen-led data collection efforts, such as those by the PAL network, and important initiatives related to indigenous data sovereignty and governance, such as the collective indigenous development of the CARE principles for good indigenous data governance. Next slide, please. We hope that you all engage in the important topics raised throughout these excellent chapters. Despite continued improvements in education data systems, the importance of understanding and addressing gaps in education data production and use remain, and we hope that you will join us in developing education data systems that are not a hindrance to, but rather a help in achieving equitable education for all learners. Thank you, and now I will turn the mic back to Moira. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Marcos and Daniel, for putting together this really powerful collection and also conceptual framework in which we can understand better what is happening in the current SDG4 education data regime. So after that overview, we're really happy now to go through a quick roundup of key messages from each of the chapters as you introduce them. As you see, we'll start with Marcos' conceptual framework and then move on to the regional chapters. Cami, over to you.
Chapter 2 of the book presents a conceptual framework to assess missing data for EDG4 of two kinds. That's it, missing because of the reporting and missing because of the framework. Using existing household and learning surveys that contribute to the UNESCO Institute of Statistics data reporting regime, the chapter shows how additional intersecting dimensions of educational inequality could be incorporated to better monitor and address the educational marginalization for those left behind in the monitoring of EDG4 by UIS. The framework situates these intersecting dimensions within a nested ecological model, including individual, family, and community and school levels. Using this framework, I find that 45% of these important intersecting dimensions that could be generated are not reported, and that this missingness affects learning indicators most prominently. By outlining 104 newly identified groups, the framework would enable a better identification of the marginalized group who remain furthest from reaching the full promise of the target of EDG4. Neglecting the intersecting direction of EDG4 indicators can lead to wider education deprivation, as shown in the chapter. The new framework will lead to a better targeting of the most disadvantaged groups and a more robust monitoring of EDG4 moving forward. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alejandro Vera from the Regional Office of UNESCO in Santiago. Here, with my colleagues Martínez Caso and Ernesto Yañez, have elaborated the chapter on education data in Latin America and the Caribbean for this book. Our chapter focuses mainly on EMIs, and is a diagnosis of what is happening in terms of data, education data in the region, the challenges and the gaps. If you read the chapter, you will find first an analysis of missing data groups. That is, group of people who are underrepresented in the information education system of our countries. That is happening, for example, with children on the move or children with disabilities. You will also find an analysis of missing data types. That is, entire educational levels, educational modalities, which are also underrepresented in our information system. That is happening in our region, for example, with early childhood education. And finally, you will find an analysis of data uses in our region. And our main conclusion there is that there is an imbalance between the production of data, which is higher and higher, and the use of this data for educational planning or for the elaboration of educational policies. So I invite you to read our chapter to see what is happening in our region, but of course to also revise all the chapters of the amazing book about the priorities of educational data to accomplish with the SDG4.
Hello, my name is James Shoebridge, and I'll be discussing Chapter 5, Priorities for Missing Data and Sustainable Development Goal 4 within the Asian region. As you may know, achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 4 for education requires a concerted effort by all countries, regions, and global organizations to track the current progress and address the challenges in collecting and producing high-quality education data. Timely, accurate, and complete data is essential for measuring learning and to identify those who are being left behind. This will help policymakers to focus on reaching the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children. These challenges are evident in Asia, which comprises almost 60% of the global population and has experienced rapid growth in recent years. The rapid economic and social development has resulted in many groups of people being left behind, which is exacerbated by recent events such as COVID, regional conflicts, and many more children are now falling behind in basic learning skills. We identify and give examples of priority areas concerning missing data groups, data types, and data purposes in relation to Sustainable Development 4 for further investigation in Asia. We also argue that urgent action is needed to address the gaps and help ensure that no child is left behind. There's an urgent need for critical analysis of missing data in regions, given the fact that on average only 51% of SDG 4 indicators were covered according to UNESCO's 216 readiness assessment. And although this has improved since the publication of this chapter, there are still challenges in disaggregating information and really identifying those children who are most disadvantaged, often falling outside of data groups. We address the following challenges in this chapter: missing data groups and types, in other words, what types of people and indicators are most systematically underrepresented in education data throughout Asia; missing data purposes, for what purpose do the current educational data system at the national and regional level serve, and what is missing? How do missing data issues potentially relate to national and local systems, and what are the dominant challenges in linking national, regional education data systems throughout Asia? We also highlight the challenges faced by the region due to its size, heterogeneity, and lack of strong regional mechanisms for data harmonization, data sharing, and developing regional best practices. Thank you very much.
Priorities for missing data in the Arab on SDG 4 in the Arab region. This chapter describes the priorities for missing data on SDG 4 in the Arab region. The Arab region is composed of 22 states who have joined the global community in committing to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Since 2015, the Arab countries have exerted considerable effort to embrace the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Yet, despite all these efforts, the region is not on track to achieve the 2030 Agenda and lags in many critical areas and on several critical targets. The sociopolitical situation and the widespread conflict and crisis in the region deepened already existing inequalities and led to the exclusion of the poorest, the most disadvantaged and marginalized, as well as those under fragile situation. This chapter describes divergent development patterns and the data context in the region and their subsequent impact on the availability, data quality, and the type of collected data in the region. And it also described the missing processes and the missing purposes in this data that are really inherent in the education systems and that really further impact the progress towards attaining the 2030 Agenda. The impact of this missing data is discussed, and recommendations are made for how to resolve these data gaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kama, and all of the other authors. There is also a chapter in the book on regional challenges in Africa, where Angela Arnott argues for the need to improve the alignment of global targets and data demands with national and regional priorities and resources. And you'll be able to find that chapter specifically in the book, in the open access book at the end of the webinar. And now we will move on to the thematic chapters with the video messages from the authors of those.
Hello, My name is Chiara Valenti. I am a research associate with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and I am the co-author of the chapter titled Missing Education Data and the SDG4 Data Regime. In 2022, 71.1 million people were internally displaced due to violence, conflict, and disasters. Among them, 11.6 million were children aged between 5 and 11, and an additional 9 million were children aged between 12 and 17. Internally displaced children often go unnoticed in official records. This is because of two reasons. Firstly, internally displaced people themselves as a whole are often unaccounted for. This is because unless they actively seek assistance or register with relevant authorities in displacement camps, evacuation centers, or collective shelters, they are not registered as they do not cross a border. Additionally, internally displaced children are further invisibilized by the lack of age disaggregated data. In 2021, of all displacement data records collected, only 5% included age disaggregated data. This hinders our ability to account for the unique challenges faced by internally displaced children. This is especially the case when looking for education-related data. Internally displaced children face unique challenges when it comes to accessing equitable and quality education. But without this information, it is impossible to account for it and tailor interventions to better address their unique challenges. It is therefore imperative to improve the availability of timely, reliable, and comparable data on IDP education as a whole. Investing in local data collection, national and regional monitoring systems, and prioritizing the safety and agency of children is essential in this process. For an in-depth exploration of this critical issue, please read more in our chapter. And for more information on internal displacement and education, please visit the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centers, or IDMC's website. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for the opportunity to record this video about our chapter in the book. Our chapter's titled Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Missing Education Data. So just quickly, I'm Dr. Jacob Pren. I work here at the University of Tasmania. My Aboriginal family are Worimi people, which the best way to explain where Worimi people are from is north of Sydney. So globally, nation-state education systems generally prioritise the dominant ethnic group's worldviews within education, but also its components such as curriculum, measures of student success, and data. So in our chapter, myself, along with my co-authors, Karen Martin and Gwaine Bodkin-Andrews, we argue that the concepts of Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance are key components for Indigenous peoples to attain good education data that reflect our worldviews and educational priorities. So at present, much education data on Indigenous peoples should actually be classified as missing educational data.
Hello, my name is Helen Longlands and I'm one of the co-authors, along with Elaine Unterhalter and Rosie Pepin-Vaughan, of the chapter on gender, missing data and SDG4. In this chapter, we explore some of the key data-related limitations and challenges associated with gender equality in education and the SDG4 measurement framework. These challenges include the uneven or non-existent availability of data, the narrow focus of data, and the inconsistent collection and reporting of data by countries. Our discussion in the chapter draws on the work of the AGI project, the Accountability for Gender Equality in Education project, and in particular on findings from a series of participatory discussions and interviews that we held as part of this project with a range of experts working on gender equality in education in South Africa, Malawi, and internationally. Through our discussion in the chapter of some of the drivers of missingness associated with gaps in data, we outline important steps for improving data for gender equality in education and closing these data gaps. In doing so, we introduce the AGI indicator framework, which offers a new, innovative approach for measuring gender equality in education. We hope our discussion of AGI and the flexible and participatory processes which underpin the work of the project, as well as the AGI framework, will prompt reflection on how different contexts can be considered through indicators and data. And finally, in terms of thinking forward to the development of any future global education goals, we hope this chapter provides food for thought on how it is possible to move beyond a narrow focus on inputs and outputs, and use data to much more effectively understand and capture the complexities of gender inequalities in education, and thus more effectively monitor progress towards gender equality. We hope you enjoy the chapter.
Right, thanks to all of the authors for those whirlwind introductions to their chapters. We will be going now into a discussion with Pali Lehohla from the Pan-African Institute for Evidence, the founder indeed. Do please continue to type your questions into the Q&A box, because after this intervention, we will move quickly on to the panel discussions. In the meantime, your questions in the Q&A box will be being answered by our authors and panelists. Pali, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I had a bit of a mishap this morning. We have a continuous energy disruptions of electricity in South Africa, something that we wish could disappear as quickly as possible. But you can see I'm putting on our national gear for football because we came third in the Africa Continental Cup. So there is something that to cheer us on. The image and the picture that has been painted by data on the matter of education in the context of leave no one behind certainly leaves us quite depressed. But what is very encouraging is the depth of analysis, the quality of the outputs of the study itself, the piercing into the most relevant of issues is quite encouraging, and we believe that this should continue. We are challenged by a world that has become more polarized, and in that polarization, the marginalized even get more marginalized. And the book adequately deals with this kind of impending danger that in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, where we wish not to leave anyone behind, increasingly we see that we are leaving more behind. The study focuses the searchlight on those that have been left behind, not only temporally in terms of time, not only geographically in terms of space and region, but in terms of themes. Nothing as crystal clear would have been useful as it's the ability to crystallize those who are left behind by these levels, by these categories. So certainly we should be pleased by this document. I was a bit worried, but I'm a facilitator. When I saw the list of inputs, they were all male. And I was beginning to get worried that another leaving others behind was in the making until I started seeing the other participants who were not necessarily male. And I felt that then we have been inclusive. One of the lenses that I think we may need to use in dealing with what we are dealing with, which will make our focus even much better and much more inclusive, one has to actually argue that inclusion is a result of mobilization, because this book helps us to mobilize. And in doing mobilization, we have to create partnerships. And one of the partnerships that can be very enduring is the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration, because the matter of education is a matter of public and a matter necessarily of public sector. This committee of experts, what they recommend in terms of their 11 strategies or 11 principles and 62 strategies, they embrace all the concerns that we have here. In particular, the one on sound policy making, that we need sound policy making, and to do so, we need data. And data is very, very crucial. And we have, therefore, partners in this respect, that partners that can help us achieve that through the lens of data. Gender, disability, indigenous groups, indigenous knowledge systems. We have a possibility of excavating this. The question that we have to ask is this: why, when we have the biggest forms of technology, this reminds me of my home in Lesotho. At some time back, when I was at university, I took vacation work. And in this vacation work, we are looking at risk perception and migrant father or a migrant husband who makes decisions far away in the mines. A letter had to be written, and that letter had to be written and then answered. That cycle could take anything from 2 to 6 weeks. And this was about farmers' perceptions and risk avoidance strategies. And farming depends on rain. And rain has no time to wait for a letter. That takes 6 weeks. Now, we have this massive technology where an answer can be obtained in nanoseconds. Why is it that the level of disadvantage continues to be the same despite the availability of this technology? Yes, data, statistics, and analyzing all these issues is very important. Is there nothing missing, which is about the political economy of organizing education? And I think these studies are beginning to point to those issues of political economy. This book is piercing us towards answering and asking the question of political economy of building human resources. 2 days ago, in Addis Ababa, I know that there is human capital session. And it's discussing these very issues of empowerment, what's the role of education, what progress is being made. Again, we see the paucity of data in that discussion. Well, when I was statistician general, we had started doing something around that. But lack of continuity, discontinuities that occur in our systems constrain us from actually building sound policy making. And sound policy making depends on continuity of foresight, continuity of understanding, modeling, of actually embedding sound policy making through data and all this. Yet, even in the presence of big and massive technological advancements that actually liberate us and hold the potential for abundance, because this information technology and the discussions that we are having here, we could have with 1 million people, we could have with several other people, because technology is non-rival. And education itself manifests itself over space and time using the technology. So the non-rival nature of the technology to facilitate access to quality education for all is within reach. Yet we see these inequities playing themselves out. That is why I see the UN CPAP lens, the UN CPAP principles, helping us to further pierce and move towards answering the question or asking the question, what is the political economy of leaving no one behind in the education sphere, both in terms of leaving others behind because they are physically disabled, because they have a different gender, because they belong to different groups, because they belong to different regions, all those. And the material of this document, united with the UN CPAP principles, may advance us to ultimately achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is the essence of change. Because only when you get educated, only when your mind works differently and creates and deals with the challenges, can advancement be made. Let me thank those who have contributed in this very, very important document that should serve us into the future, into the current and into the future, and hopefully change our lens, our understanding, and therefore our responses to this challenge of the sustainable.
Thank you, Pali, for those words, for reminding us of that key question about the political economy. And first asking the question, what is the purpose of any data regime? Before we can then think about what data we need, how much data we need, how we're going to set up this data regime, and being able to monitor that regime for, yes, efficiently collecting the data, but in addition to that efficiency, really asking the questions around the effectiveness of the use of those data by learners, by teachers, by government, civil society, UN, international organizations, and also the effectiveness of that data regime towards really pointing us in the right direction towards achieving SDG 4. I'm very pleased to hand over now to Amita Chadgar, who is Professor of Education Policy and Interim Associate Dean of International Studies at Michigan State University in the USA. Her work examines the influence of home, school, and community contexts on educational access and achievement of children, particularly in resource-constrained environments. Through her analysis of diverse, large-scale national, regional, and cross-national datasets, she studies the role of policy-relevant variables in ensuring that children and adults in resource-constrained environments have equal access to high-quality learning opportunities, irrespective of their backgrounds. Amita, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm very happy to hand over now to you and the moderators of the panels. Amita.
Thank you so much, Moira, for the very kind introduction. Good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. I thank the organizers for this invitation, and I want to compliment Marcos and Daniel and all the authors for this outstanding contribution to the NORRAG series on international education and development. It is my pleasure to introduce the two panels. As I think about the question of missing data, what I find compelling that the consideration of data, and especially missing data, draw our attention to both the macro systems and micro individual concerns. On the one hand, data collection, harmonization requires systems that function at scale. Scales require standardization, well-designed systems, well-functioning apparatus. We need standard definition of what we are seeking to understand, standard approaches to data collection, uniform approaches to combine data, to prepare, to clean, to keep the data secure. Approaches that are well accepted, understood, transparent, widely available, and accessible. So on the one hand, the question of missing data speaks to the value of large-scale, national, or otherwise macro systems that depend above all on making explicit every aspect of and standard of this datafication process. But at the same time, what is important about the consideration of data and missing data is that we use and we need these macro systems to function well, because what we care ultimately about are the micro level, individual and nuanced experiences of those whom these numbers represent. those who have traditionally been underserved by our systems, those, and individuals and geographies on which we have not necessarily gathered rich information historically. Children with disability may get left out of school-based data collections if they are not present in school. Children affected by conflict and internal displacement may similarly be absent from standard census data collections, as we have heard in the previous presentations. We know that census categories themselves may systematically ignore or underreport segments of populations if their unique aspects and identities are not part of the data collection apparatus. There is also the question of what sorts of questions are we asking to better understand the challenges facing specific subgroups. I often think the data we need for information and data we need for action can often be same, but can often be different. In my work, I spend a lot of attention and time thinking about teacher issues. And for instance, I know that there are fewer female teachers uniformly in rural locations across the world. But that information is valuable, but it does not tell me the why and the what. So what I see these two panels that we are about to get into doing is effectively bringing together this macro issues of how data systems work at large scale and within regions with these micro considerations. The first panel focusing more on the macro consideration and the second more on this micro consideration. And I'm very much looking forward to their remarks. Just as a conclusion of my own remarks and before we go into the panel, I wanted to offer 3 thoughts for further consideration and discussion. One is that in the spirit of chapter 2 that we have heard, the ecological framework, I think as we consider the question of missing data in education, which is crucial for our commitment to SDG 4, we might continue to think that education is a sociological enterprise, is a social enterprise. What other data systems and existing data sources from health, from infrastructure, from labor markets can we lean in on as education scholars and education practitioners to better inform our practice? I also want a minute to acknowledge that when we think about the burden of missing data, the challenge of missing data, I hope we consider on whom the burden is placed to collect those missing data. For instance, in our work, we have seen that EMIS data are very valuable, but often those data get collected by teachers in school systems who then essentially get removed from their day-to-day work because they are busy filling out government forms and collecting data, which is very valuable. But collecting data creates its own burden. And my final observation would be that as we make considerations of missing data, I hope we also consider who is missing from the use of this data. And I hope we continue to consider ways in which we can better incorporate those for whom ultimately data are intended, the teachers, the principals, and the practitioners on the ground. Thank you so much, and I'm excited to listen to the 2 panels.
And for our first panel, on GAP's progress and localization of the SDG 4 data regime in 4 regions, we're very glad to have with us Nelson Opong, who will be moderating this panel. Nelson, over to you.
Hello, and thanks for the kind invitation. Let me also add to the words of compliment to Marcos and Daniel for this wonderful contribution, and to all the contributors for this book. I think we've highlighted a number of very important themes, but I'm very excited, particularly about the opportunity that the book provides for a more realistic and informed conversation between researchers and academics like us and those also in the field. So we have 3 authors for this chapter who have kindly offered to share a few thoughts for this panel. So I have a few questions, and my first question is to the authors. What you consider as the most urgent changes that are needed to the education data systems? And what do you think that... so the question for the authors, the first question that I have is what do you consider as the most urgent changes needed to the education data systems in order to address the marginalization of missing groups in your region? And I'm going to start with Karma.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Nelson, for introducing the questions and the panel. From the chapter that I have written, we can see that the data collection in the Arab region suffers from very serious limitations. There's limited availability of systematic, reliable, and valid data, which is subject to segregation. And that's why one of the urgent needs for us is to work on quality of the statistical information that needs to be produced nationally and regionally, and then the frequency of this data, as well as make them internationally comparable. And definitely we need to work on the transparency of the statistical information and being accessible to the various stakeholders. This is one issue that we need to think of. Another thing that we need to work on basically is we need to have currently we don't have statistical apparatus. It's quite deficient in the Arab region, and we need to work on a cohesive and integrated statistical system in most of the Arab countries, and to make use of different kind of data in order to be able to reply to the various indicators on the global data sets. The Arab countries need to establish common education agendas for monitoring the frameworks. They need to develop new data sources and to update the current data that they are using. And very importantly, they need to update and modernize the statistical legislation. As Daniel mentioned in his introduction, we really need to work on updating and modernizing on our statistical legislation and encourage the development of national strategies for the development of statistics. Definitely an urgent need is to enhance the capacity of those working on statistical data and developing the databases to make data more accessible to all the stakeholders and to be able to make use of it for research and development. Without this robust data, it is not possible to really make any kind of adequate planning or allocation of resources, which is necessary to achieve the objectives of the SDGs. So these are the main changes and urgent changes that we need to focus on in the Arab region.
Thank you so much for the very concise and very informative response. So I'll move to our second author, Martin. And Martin is going to cover both the Latin America and the Caribbean region. Again, the question is, what do you consider as the most urgent changes that we need to apply to the education data system in order to address some of the problems and gaps that you identified in your chapter?
Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you very much, Nelson, and congratulations to the entire NORRAG team to the tremendous effort in creating this book. I will be answering this question in Spanish. En lo que respecta
As far as the challenges are concerned, I think that the America and Caribbean region, well, indeed, is faced with a lot of challenges at methodological level, the identification of vulnerable populations or groups, security issues. I could really list a whole range of issues. So I would say that among the more important challenges, a challenge that is key to improve the situation in order to indeed lift all the barriers, well, it has to do with indeed reinforcing and enhancing the culture of use of information. In the region, we see that there is a very marked imbalance between the efforts that are invested in producing data and the efforts invested in using that data in policy making, in improving education systems. So one main challenge for me would be to improve the conditions of use of information, of educational information or data that is being produced. Second challenge, it has to do with the integration of these education data. There's an increasing demand for better information, for more information, and the main source of information are the EMIS, the Education Management Information System. Now, they can grow as systems in order to face or to respond to these increased demands, but they have limitations. So we need to enhance the integration processes between the different data sources in order to create an ecosystem that allows us to respond to the different requests, but also to be able to better focus on the more vulnerable groups. And I would say that a third urgent measure to be taken has to do with reinforcing the regional bodies that produce data and information. I'm talking here about international bodies, but as well other actors, other partners that monitor education. You know, in countries, we produce much more data than what is available at regional level, as a consequence of the difficulties in data matching, in interpreting the data. So international bodies have the possibility here to really launch an agenda in order to accompany, to enhance data production within countries and make that data available. That data is available indeed at national level, but they are not comparable data very often. Thank you very much.
So our last panelist is James from who is an international monitoring and evaluation consultant. And I was wondering if you could also share your response from the Asian region.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I think just first, before going into discussing some of the challenges, it's important to identify the main groups of people, because I think the challenges are very much specific to those groups of people. And these three groups are probably the largest three groups in Asia. They include invisible or poorly visible children. And in Asia, these are typically undocumented or displaced children, children of illegal immigrants or migrant workers, or those living in substandard housing. It can include also, as a second group, children attending schools in conflict regions, and they're often members of minority ethnic groups who are reluctant to share data with government officials. And then we've got children who are attending non-government schools, and non-government schools or institutions in general are classified usually as schools that are receiving either partial government funding or do not receive any government funding. And schools that don't receive government funding often have less scrutiny and are less visible in government systems than those which are receiving funding. So each of these groups typically requires or has specific challenges associated with, and the solutions therefore apply to those specific groups. And many of the solutions are not technical, they're more in the domain of policy, legislative changes, or strategic partnerships. So looking at some of these, in the case of invisible and poorly visible children, and at the legislative or policy level, improving the identification and registration processes for invisible or poorly visible children helps to identify them and track them, and registering and acknowledging migrant or displaced children and giving them access to government services from which they're often either excluded or partially or fully excluded will help to include them in government databases and systems, and therefore include them in surveys and information gathering exercises that typically focus on those institutions covered under government systems. It's also probably important to note that improving the identification of children often means refining the standards and processes. For example, in the case of children with disabilities, this in turn enables the targeting of individuals with interventions tailored to their specific needs. For children attending schools in conflict zones, strategic partnerships between NGOs and CSOs who are operating in those conflict zones, often mediated by development partners, can help them to share data with the government because that data is often collected by NGOs and CSOs, and can help them to overcome or deal with issues relating to data privacy and protection. And then for those children attending non-government schools or operating in sectors where institutions are not properly recognised or registered with the government, and this can include whole areas like non-formal education or TVET, at the legislative and policy level, we need to have strong legislation concerning the falsification of data, completeness of data, and mandating complete data and submission of data for all institutions and services operating throughout a country. And at the technical level, data systems need to be made accessible to those institutions, even if they're non-government. And there needs to be standards put in place to enable data sharing between systems that may be operating in those non-government institutions and government systems. I think also just quickly two cross-cutting issues. One of the main challenges is measuring, storing, and using information concerning the learning environment, teacher quality and learning processes, and understanding what common standards can be applied to giving us some indication of what quality actually means in these areas. And also as a final challenge in Asia is comparing and combining data from different sources or modalities such as household survey and other forms of data such as learning assessments, EMIS, ad hoc surveys and other means. And that's an ongoing challenge, not just in Asia, but globally. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. So my next follow-up question is really in terms of action. So and I was wondering if the panel could reflect on what we have seen as the most promising changes that are underway in your respective regions. So I'm going to start with Kama from the Middle East, and if you could give a response to that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. One of the issues that we highlighted in our chapter was that when the Arab region was regarding the inadequate policy frameworks and the policy gaps that are in the Arab region, and the lack of integration and alignment of the policies with the development and the SDG framework and the Agenda 2030. What I can report, and happily, is that in recent years, there has been a great improvement in that respect. The SDG report to be released next month by ESCO, the 2024 one, is really focusing on the policy initiatives in the Arab region and what has been done in recent years in this regard. Similarly, Education for Sustainable Development, ESD now, is taking quite precedent. And one of the priority areas are the policy initiatives. And a recent mapping of the ESD initiatives in the Arab region also revealed that there has been a considerable focus by Arab countries on the policies and developing new policies that really would enable the countries to meet the SDG objectives and criteria. And I can say that which is going to be released in the March report, that all the countries, or nearly all the countries, have developed policies to leave no one behind. This was a main focus of the policies, the new policies that were developed by Arab countries. Now, this is one area which has really improved, new changes since we wrote the chapter. Another issue which we identified was the lack of statistical data and monitoring and things like that. And we know that Arab countries made up of different regions: the GCC, the middle income, the least developed, and then we have the conflict-ridden. And each one has its own characteristics. The GCC countries are advancing quite rapidly. It's not the same with the other regions, but I can also report that even in middle-income countries, they have been working on improving the management of their education system through annual reporting, development of data portals, and the reform of evaluation systems. Even in middle-income countries, this has been done, and we can say that, for example, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Palestine, and Tunisia are regularly publishing a national education monitoring report annually. So that's an improvement. Even with the least developed countries, they are working on reversing the trend of weak standardization and weak reporting. And I can give an example. In the Comoros, the Transitional Education Project really seeks to improve the use of data at the national level, and they are developing annual statistical yearbooks. So even the least developed are trying to improve on that dimension. A third area of, I think, improvement in the Arab region is a number of countries, middle income and least developed and conflict, are launching a variety of responses to the educational needs of school-age children coming from refugee children. And we have considerable numbers of refugees and immigrants in these two sets of groups of countries. By adopting policies to allow refugee students to enroll in public schools free of charge. So this has been recent development. Even in the least developed countries, they have taken steps to integrate into the education into their social protection system. And this was mentioned before, the integration of the social with the education system. I can give examples from Djibouti's national program for family solidarity and Mauritania's Takaful national social transfer program and Sudan's Shamil program. They're also all integrating the education within their social protection systems. Even the least developed countries, they're implementing meal programs and doing capacity for development in regions and for communities with higher levels of poverty. And these were part of the marginalized that we have talked about. I would also like finally to mention that even in conflict-affected Arab countries, and they are unfortunately increasing, especially with the events in the last 6 months, they have developed transitional educational plans that attempt to directly address the legacies of conflict and recover the deep disruptions of the education system. Most countries in the conflict-affected group have launched plans to reintegrate internally the displaced persons into the education system and provide social and emotional learning support for these students who are experiencing conflict-related stress and so these projects have been going on quite rapidly in the last 2 years.
Thank you so much. Yes, and So I'll move to Martin. And if you could please make your response brief so we can give some space for question and answers from the audience. Yeah.
Thank you, Nelson. Bueno, en lo que respecta a
Well,
los...
as far as the most promising changes that we have identified in our region, well, I would talk about two. Well, it's said that around 10 and 15 years, well, this change already started. So now we have a register with nominal data of both students and teachers. Now, this is quite a recent initiative in our region, in the Latin American and Caribbean region. And this has allowed us to have additional information and data. We have now data that allow us to better identify the more vulnerable groups, or people with disabilities, people with problems of mobility, people coming from poorer backgrounds, for instance. And these registers allow us to linkage educational data with other information systems and informations and data produced by countries. So this is really a big innovation, launched about 10 to 15 years ago. Now it's really consolidating itself, and this opens up very promising perspectives towards the future. That's the first one. Secondly, is what I would call a forced innovation as regards our information systems. Because of the education crisis, the unprecedented education crisis that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the information systems were forced to indeed respond to new unprecedented needs in order to really guide the education response policies in view of the pandemics. And we see that in many, many countries, there's a lot of innovation that is being introduced, whereas in other countries this would have taken a lot of time. And for instance, a clear example is an early warning system development in order to prevent indeed school dropouts. And this is really linked to the pandemic and the post-pandemic period. And thirdly, some of the initiatives that are really being enhanced and reinforced at regional level in order to match information, in order to monitor specific groups in the framework of a work that is being carried out with the different countries of the region. So we're working with the countries in the region so as to consolidate the regional monitoring systems, but it also allows those countries to reinforce, to enhance their own information systems. So there are two initiatives I would like to talk about. Now we have, of course, the Office of UNESCO in Santiago. We have one initiative in order to monitor the number of moving students, so students on the move, which is an increasing phenomenon. It's quite worrying. And another monitoring system for students with disabilities. There's also another initiative, for instance, a system in order to monitor higher education, and other initiatives in order to indeed monitor other groups. Now, again, perspectives here are very promising. Thank you.
I'll give the floor to James.
Thank you very much. By coincidence, also, I was going to cover several of the topics that Martin covered. So great minds think alike. And I think we're seeing similar innovations in Asia. So I would certainly start with the tracking of individuals, and in particular, individual children. So most countries now in Asia have moved towards individual tracking, which means that they keep a unique record on every child, usually within just one ministry, the Ministry of Education or Health. And they'll have a unique identifier for that children, and they'll have the background information, they'll have the learning progress and attainment, the health information. And so this has really enabled a much greater emphasis on targeting individual children according to their needs, such as through pro-poor or disability support. It also has afforded the opportunity to track children in and out of school, and therefore encouraging interventions to target individual children who may have dropped out or be at risk of dropping out of the system. And some of these systems run algorithms to determine which children are at most at risk to drop out as well. It also means in some countries that we're starting to see data exchanges occur at the top level in which data between different sectors can be shared. So, for example, whether the child is recorded in the health system, whether they've had their vaccinations, whether they've undergone child protection, and so on. And within the bounds of data protection and privacy, we can therefore see which children may be at risk, which children have received essential services. So this benefits beyond the area of just SDG 4. And this also enables us to build up a whole national record of each person, in particular the children, because that's one of the main interests that we have. It also provides us much richer data for analytical purposes, and this means that doing analysis on things like SDG 4.5.1, which is for the parity indices, and means that we can disaggregate the data by a very rich variety of attributes and variables, including many that would not normally be in MS databases and others. I'll move to just the second opportunity, I think, has been also the drive towards decentralization of data management and access to the institutional level down to the individual level, where you're seeing a lot of use of mobile applications and mobile access to ensure that actors at the school level, parents, teachers, students can all start to access data. And that means people are engaging with the data much more readily. The data becomes much richer, it becomes more validated, and the speed at which data can be obtained and processed becomes much faster, and therefore the speed at which we can act and make decisions. And it also helps to reduce paper-based record keeping, which is slow, cumbersome, and inaccurate, and facilitates communication between all levels of the government to the national level. So as a result, we have much more comprehensive and rich data in areas where that is being achieved. Then I would finally turn, not to take any more time, but finally turn to the third point of regional coordination and data standards. I think we're seeing a lot more activity with forums at the regional level in the Pacific and Asia, partners such as UNESCO, UNICEF, etc., bringing people together and establishing standards that mean that we can compare data between different countries in the region. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I'm told we just have a minute to finish the panel. We've received quite a lot of questions, and the questions touch on the involvement of actors. Others have asked about the ways in which your thoughts on how we can synchronize and harmonize data across different areas. And then there's a question about whether you have any suggestions about the ways in which we can augment the healthy use of data, so the kind of user end issues. So just a quick response, if any of you want to take, if you have any idea about the ways in which we can improve the use, particularly across a variety of areas. And Martin, I've seen your hand, so if you could give a brief answer to that.
Gracias.
Yes, thank you. I'll be very brief. I think that this is indeed a very interesting and challenging question. The key here is to make it meaning. That is, give meaning to the data. What do the data, what are they useful for, especially with regards to the areas we're covering? Very often we make data available, but not very often we ask ourselves, what is the data that we need for what? What is the problem that is being solved through this data from the perspective of the users and not from the perspective of data experts? Most of data users are not data experts, they're not data scientists, and they need follow-up, they need capacity building, and they need to know how to make the link between the data and their own needs. If the information does not solve the problems of users in terms of system management, well, it will be very difficult for them to take ownership of the data. Thank you.
If any other panelist wants to chip in, so considering the differences, particularly in terms of parents, children, and teachers, the variety of these interests, how do we augment user experience? And if there's any, James, yeah. So you go for the final.
Sure, thanks. I'll just build on what Martin said, which is I think very much that what helps tremendously is if the systems are built and tailored towards the purposes of the users. So not all users are going to be undertaking policy analysis. Many users just want to use systems for the functions that the systems have. For example, transferring students, transferring teachers, looking at whether they have students who may be at risk of dropping out or who are not attending, or looking at the exam results. So it's very much specific to the purposes of the user. And if the system, both through its functions and through its reporting, is tailored to that person, then it helps a lot. Also, whether they can access it, and that's where I came back before to the fact that mobile devices are being a key access point in Asia now, because everyone has a mobile, but not many people have a computer at the school in many countries. So that's become a useful point to be able to engage people in data and systems at the grassroots level. And that's not just for people who operate or who are employed in the education sector, but also it includes people like parents and students and other people who can access a variety of information that can be made available to them, whether it's just specifically for them, whether it's for the school, the community, or the region. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. And we are ready to move to the next panel. So I'll hand over to Maura now.
Thank you very much, Nelson, for keeping us on time. And thank you for the panelists for sharing their wisdom and their thoughts for action. So we will now be moving into panel 2, Data and Inequalities in SDG 4 Data, and welcoming Anne Smiley, who is the Deputy Project Director at International Rescue Committee, who will be moderating the panel for us. Thank you. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Moira, and thanks to everyone. A huge thank you to the team that pulled this work together. It's really impressive to see how much has happened actually in the last 10 years or so that I've been working on education data issues. And I think we should all feel inspired and excited about the progress, and also concerned about the vast amount of work that we still have to do. And yet there are many initiatives in place. We're going to focus in this panel specifically on these issues, these thematic issues around data and inequalities. So we have 3 key topics that we'll be discussing in this panel. We'll be talking about Marcos's structural framework around identifying drivers of inequality. We'll be hearing from Helen and Rosie about gender, and we'll be hearing from Chiara more about her work with internal displacement. And in order to save time, because I know we're running a little bit behind, we will jump into the questions. And what I'd like to do is ask one member of each of the thematic teams to answer the question that I'm going to pose first, just in the same format that we did in the last panel. So then we'll do 2 to 3 minutes for each of those, maybe focus on 2 minutes so that we can save some time. And then we'll go to a second question, and then we'll wrap up hopefully with some Q&A. So the first question, and I'm going to start with, I think we'll start with Helen, rather, from the gender team. What is the biggest misconception about education data in terms of gender? I will hand over immediately to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Hi, everybody. So I think we would highlight 2 main misconceptions, in particular, that are linked with education, gender and data, and which we discuss in more detail in our chapter. So the first misconception is that gender parity is a sufficient way of measuring gender equality. So gender parity measures the ratio of girls to boys or women to men in a given aspect of education, such as enrolment or participation. It's a clear and straightforward measure, But as has been well documented by many people researching or working on gender equality in education, gender parity treats gender inequality as a problem that can be easily counted and doesn't tell us anything about the complexities of gender inequalities or how we might record or keep track of how these complexities change over time. So gender parity cannot tell us very much about the nuances of reality and context and how people's everyday lives are shaped by many and diverse forms and sources of gender discrimination and injustice in education systems, linked with, for example, policies, pedagogy, curricula, violence, or the ways in which gender inequalities intersect with other forms of inequality, linked with, for example, poverty, disability, ethnicity, and location. And so as we discuss in the chapter, in South Africa, for example, where we conducted some of our research for the AGI project, the Accountability for Gender Equality in Education project, important data gaps that were noted by our research participants are associated with marginalised individuals and groups, intersecting inequalities, gender-based violence and safety around schools and other sites of education, discrimination in education on the basis of sexuality or gender identity, and opportunities, achievements, and what is valued in and through education beyond the foundational subjects of mathematics and literacy. And these are important issues that gender parity cannot measure or cannot adequately measure. And then the second misconception about data and gender, which leads on from the first one, is the misconception that it is perhaps too challenging to think differently and more comprehensively about what gender equality is and what achieving it might entail, and therefore too challenging to collect and use data that reflect or can allow for a deeper understanding of gender inequalities and what achieving gender equality might entail across different contexts. And Rosie will be expanding a bit on both these issues in her answer to question 2, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's great. I will then pass over to Chiara to answer the same question. What's the biggest misconception about education data in terms of internal displacement? Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. So I think the biggest misconception is when it comes to education data regarding IDPs, is the assumption that the existing national education systems are capable of adequately capturing the needs and challenges faced by internally displaced people and internally displaced children more specifically. We highlight this invisibility in the chapter quite a bit. I think one of the biggest factors is the fact that IDPs, when it comes to more general data collection regarding IDPs, are difficult to track and monitor. These are displaced individuals who are not crossing an international border. So their registration is something that causes repercussions throughout the collection of data regarding their needs. And when it comes to education, it's no different. There's another 2 factors that aid in this invisibility is the limited government capacity to collect this data. We were speaking earlier of the boundaries that there are economic boundaries in collecting this data. It is expensive, it is time consuming, and there are often issues of accessibility that limit this collection of data that, despite necessary and timely, is difficult to follow through with. And then finally, there's a reluctance in certain contexts to recognize IDPs. So a mixture of these factors lead to a complete invisibility of IDPs when it comes to data on them, including education data. There is also this prevailing belief that standard education data regarding humanitarian and development crises is able to account for IDPs, when in reality, it's often aggregated. So displacement status becomes displacement. It's not IDPs, refugees, asylum seekers, but it is simply displaced children, meaning that these experiences are kind of lumped into one. So in the chapter, we emphasize how these gaps in not only age disaggregated data, so understanding the different needs by age brackets, but also by displacement status, really hampers our understanding of the unique challenges faced by internally displaced children and impedes the development of targeted policies and interventions that are capable of addressing and recognizing these specific needs.
Thank you for that very clear response. And I think I'm hearing some themes really emerging from both of your responses that I think we can now take into the third presenter's or third respondent's response. Marcos, can you tell us a little bit about what you think are the biggest misconceptions with regard to the drivers of inequality that you're seeing in the data?
Hello, everybody. Yes, I mean, what I would say, I mean, I already mentioned it, but the main problem is the framework which is employed by UAS. That framework doesn't address at all wider marginalization because it's very narrow and very simplistic. For instance, in a way that it goes back to what people been actually saying before in this launch, the political economy of education. What is it for the data, right? So there are different reasons why it's not fully comprehensive, the framework used by UAS. One can take, for instance, the typical combinations of overlapping disadvantages which are given by gender, location, and wealth. So they're too narrow. We know that has been said by Amit and also for other discounted people that already spoke, that education is a social phenomenon, which, I mean, it'd be foolish to think that first, you can represent the scope of inequality by only three drivers and the overlapping connections. And secondly, that the drivers are static across the life course. It's not the same, the factor pushing kids out of school in primary level that are upper secondary. They are completely different. So, and if you look at the UAS framework, you will see that particularly, so you use a more comprehensive framework. In the case of learning indicators, you don't see at all information on schools. Right? You have information about whether the school is private or public, whether the school are a low socioeconomic status or high, whether the school got more or less indigenous people, etc. So how can you explain the degree of inequality on learning if you don't actually include a key nexus on the learning, which is the school, right? The school level information. And also linking back to what Helen already mentioned for the gender chapter, that for perhaps a different perspective to Helen, but slightly in the same vein, that there are no cross synergies between SDG 4 and SDG 5, right? And that's again foolish because one of, for instance, the main drivers or the main sources of inequality for girls' education is, if you like, backward social norms or negative social norms like child marriage. And all this data, I mentioned, that is actually there. You got a lot of information on gender social norms in the DHS. You have plenty of information on school, teachers, blah, blah, learning service, but they are excluded. So in a sense, that comes to the core. I mean, what do you want the data for? To illuminate what? So that's more a conceptual limitation for me, right? Which in a sense is a conceptual limitation about how the targets are constructed, right? Measuring what, no? Yeah, I stop there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I think this is fascinating, and I think we're coming to an understanding, I think, and some more clarity around how the metrics and systems that we have in place are insufficient, really, to get to education inequities that we know are there. And we need to really expand our thinking as a sector on the sources of data that we're looking at, some low-hanging fruits that are already there and ready for us to be taking advantage of, but also the data collection systems that we have in place don't always get to the intersectionalities and the nuances of the inequities that we know are there and that we need to be looking at in a more creative, more nuanced way. I'm going to ask a second question, and I know we're running short on time, so let's try to keep it short. The second question, and we'll go in the same order, but we'll start with Rosie this time from the gender team. What is the most promising change that's underway? What are those opportunities when it comes to education data and gender?
Thanks very much, Anne.
One promising change that I think we can definitely see is related to the increasing pace of technological advances, which Pali Lehohla was referring to earlier, and meaning that purely that more data is being collected in all areas of our lives. And although simply having more data doesn't mean progress, there are opportunities to think laterally about what new insights we might get into how gender affects educational experiences. For anything, for example, on data on internet or mobile phone use, or more granular data on time use, and also advances in comparing policies. For example, the online EJA resource led by UNESCO and the Population Council. So in theory, there are also new opportunities to think about intersectional data as well, and linking on data beyond the education sector, and also on looking at longitudinal data to get a better understanding of how inequalities earlier in life affect gender inequalities later in life. Now, quite a lot of the data that we'd like to use isn't yet easily accessible for many of the reasons we've just been discussing. And in gender, we can think about things like data on gender-based violence in schools, or gender in teacher training, or how gender features in the curriculum. Through work, and this includes our work on the AGI project, we've been trying to highlight that in many cases the data is actually there in some form, as Marcus was referring to as well, but it needs to be collated or made available or more accessible in other ways. And in other cases, some important data isn't yet collected, but it is possible to lobby and advocate for improvements by working with other organisations. And this is the second point that I want to make, is that certainly in terms of gender, there's a lot of political will at the moment to discuss gender equality. And even though this is often framed quite narrowly as girls' and women's education, we can harness this interest and momentum to lobby for better data and better and more participatory use of data as well. There is undoubtedly a growing global community of practice around gender and education data. And that's something which in our project, our AGI project, we've tried to sort of be part of building up. And not wanting to underplay the challenges, but part of what we're aiming to show through our AGI project and what we've discussed in our chapter is that through developing better coordination between organisations, better collaboration, better sharing of knowledge about and for data, and with better resourcing and investment, it's possible to kind of foster some improvements on the data that's collected and to make better use of existing data. And lastly, just in relation to that point, is that these collaborations and wider conversations that are happening have opened up more nuanced ways of thinking about what is gender equality in education, and therefore what do we need to measure. And through our work on the project, we've been drawing on the capability approach, trying to think about a measurement framework for gender equality in education that can encompass a deeper and more holistic understanding of what gender equality is beyond parity, as Helen was referring to earlier. So again, it's the understanding that gender equality isn't just about women and girls, and especially not a problem for girls and women to solve, but it entails a broader understanding of what gender is, how does it work in society, how do men and boys need to be part of the process of change, and overall that gender needs to be understood in a much more nuanced and complex way. And so by taking that more nuanced understanding, we can significantly improve the way in which we measure and monitor progress towards gender equality in education. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those ways forward. And I think there's a lot we have to do, but it seems like there's some promising opportunities. Let's go to Chiara to talk a bit about those same opportunities when it comes to internal displacement and what's going on in a positive sense.
Thank you, Anne. So I think quite a bit of what Rosie just mentioned goes for data on internal displacement as well. There's this constant push, and we see a lot of improvements when it comes to enhancing data quality regarding IDP education and data sharing. I think one point that is still requires more work on, and we see slowly some movement towards, is the capacity of comparability. So oftentimes we have, as previously mentioned, a lot of forms of data collection that exist. We have a lot of data on displacement, and we require more capacity for collaboration. So such an initiative that shows us what a collaboration like this would look like is the collaboration between the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move and the Responsible Data for Children collaboration. Their aim is to streamline approaches, improve statistics, and ensure ethical data management, which is key when we speak of children's education more specifically. And additionally, initiatives such as those mentioned in the previous panel by UNESCO, as well as with UNICEF, are actively working on developing global data portals, so accessing this data. Sometimes there's so much data that it's more an issue of getting to it rather than having it and collecting it. There's also initiatives of strengthening institutional information systems and utilizing pre-existing displacement data sets to refine that data on children displaced due to climate change, conflict, and so on and so forth. Another promising approach is something that has actually developed within IDMC in the past year is our severity assessments. Our severity assessments essentially aim at analyzing and assessing the severity of the conditions of internal displacement, and including access and quality of education. And previously, this was something that we were only able to do through qualitative methods, which provided a much more high level of understanding of the situation and severity of IDP education in different countries. Today, with the use of multisectoral needs assessments that allow for displacement disaggregation, which is what I mentioned previously, such as those conducted by Impact Reach, we are able to have much more granular understanding of IDP education in tens of countries. It's a small step, but it is a massive step for us to be able to assess specifically IDP education through this data that informs humanitarian actions every year. So these are just some few approaches that are quite promising in our field.
Thank you so much, Chiara. And it really is helpful to understand what all of these different initiatives are and the opportunities that are opening up. Marcos, let's hear from you. What are those promising changes that are underway? Are you seeing some progress? Are you seeing some opportunities when it comes to that conceptual framework? Go ahead.
I mean, the short answer will be no, because really there is a conceptual framework, and a conceptual framework needs a complete rethinking about an agenda and how inequality come about. But let me elaborate a little bit on that by softening the no, if you like. So I checked what has been discussed on the Conference on Education, Data and Statistics, that event between UNESCO and the World Bank last week. A really important event, supposed to be, internationally. And then I saw that it seems to me that still the emphasis, or what by quickly checking, that is about access and coverage of indicators. For instance, I saw that they can increase using admin data use coverage by 50% in a particular indicator. So you see that still doesn't go to the issue that, from our perspective, the perspective of the book, is actually to find the nuances of inequalities, not a simplistic way and expanding the coverage of inequality. So from that point of view, didn't see much progress on that. So there are still missing leading drivers, which already are there in the data set. Then you have, of course, in the same conference, you have some, in the last work done by these stakeholders, you see some improvements, technical improvement, you like it's a higher coverage on completion rate and school children. I was figured here from 62 to 98% using a particular Bayesian blah blah technique. You got also the use of SDG4 scorecards. You have the use of assessment for minimum professional levels to fill certain data gap on learning. But you see, still, for me, that there need to be a rethinking about with existing data, rethinking how we actually measuring progress through the intersection of drivers of inequality, which, as we said at the starting of this book launch, they are the most group. The intersectionality affect mostly the most marginalized groups, right? So I would say as a positive, what I heard from the point of view, for instance, Latin America and Asia authors, like that they talk about the use of nominal data with registration, the combination of data from different sectors, health, blah, blah, and a push for regional comparability. So I think that's the exercise for me to
Thank you.
That's it. Sorry.
I know, no, it's okay. Perfect. I think we have just 2 minutes left, but I think a key takeaway from me is that the status quo isn't really what we need now. We need to think differently. We need to think about these inequities, and we need to think about the low-hanging fruits and also the opportunities that we have across to really expand access to data, expand use of data, but also expand the way that we think about these frameworks. And I think there's a great opportunity here, especially with emerging technologies. There's a couple questions. I know we almost no time. I want to quickly have a really specific one from David Cunyu saying, we know that collecting intersectional data is challenging, even in stable contexts. Rosie, do you have practical ideas on how we can advance this practice in crisis contexts? Handing to you, Rosie.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, David. It's a really important question. I guess straight off now, I don't have immediate advice, but what I would say is this is something that definitely in the AGI project we have flagged up as something which is very important of how to think about gender equality data in crisis contexts. You're absolutely right. It's a very important issue. One reference that you might find interesting, so the Education Cannot Wait initiative has a kind of new initiative around gender equality. I will put the link in the chat and so you can have a look at that as well. But it's a great question. Thank you. I don't know if Helen, you want to add anything?
No, thanks, Rosie. Well, I was just going to say you could put the link to our project website as well, which has different kinds of resources which we're updating as well. So even when we're able to answer this question better, keep an eye on our website because we'll put updates on the work we're doing at the project and in the collaborations that we have. Yeah.
It's a difficult question and we're all looking for the answer. I think it's not only David, so we really look forward to that. I will hand back to Moira now because I think we're at time. Thank you all so much for a great panel.
Yes, thanks to, sorry, my microphone got caught up. Thank you to all of you. I'm also putting into the chat a link to the Education in Emergencies Data and Evidence Summit that was held in the middle of last year here in Geneva. It was a co-organized conference. There's a lot of really important information at that link for those of you who are interested on the data and education and evidence emergency side, as well as the links that Rosie said that she will be posting. So without further ado, this is the moment where we get to say thank you very much to Edward Elgar Publishing for being our partner on the NORRAG International Series for international education and development. This is the fifth book in the series, Achieving Equitable Education. The QR code that you see on your screen, there will also, I'm sure, be a link in the chat where you can access the full contents of the book that we've just been able to give you a very small taster of today, a very delicious taster, and a taster that has certainly whet our appetite to know more. You'll find all of the content, open access, available online if you follow this QR code, and also the link that is now in the chat. All of the participants or people who signed up will also receive the highlights of this event, and those links will come to you by email as well. So a quick word about two associated events that will be happening, both of them hybrid, where we have an event at the University of Sussex in the UK on the 18th of March, where we will be diving more deeply into those thematic chapters. And also on the 10th of April at the Indiana University in Bloomington, another hybrid event looking at some of these questions that have been raised in our Missing Education Data and Inequity Summit today. Do note that in some parts of the world, the clocks will change before the 10th of April, so be aware to make sure that your calendar is updated in the right direction there. And At the beginning of March, we will be participating in the CIS conference. If you are a NORRAG member, you can send the information about your session and your panel to us, and we will make sure that we promote it to other NORRAG members as well. And on the 25th of March, we're also co-hosting an event with the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute on decolonization, anti-racism, and legal pedagogy. So focus there on legal questions and education in legal questions too. And as I said, all participants, all 433 people who signed up will receive a follow-up email and a link to the publication. You don't have to wait for that. You can follow the link right now to the Edward Elgar website, where you'll be able to download that publication, open access. And the open access there has been facilitated by our partnership with the Swiss Development Cooperation Agency that has gone on for a very long time. They're a very close partner to NORRAG and enable a great deal of our work, including the open access of our publications. You will also have the evaluation form, and we would particularly invite those experts who are in this webinar or watching it at a later date. If you are an expert from the Global South, do please join our South Also Knows database of Global South experts. The idea here is to have a searchable database, so the next time somebody says, oh, we don't have an expert from the Global South on this particular topic, you can point them in the direction of this publicly searchable database, and for experts from the Global South to be able to promote their expertise here. So, on that note, a huge thank you to all of the contributors to the book in terms of the content, the time, and the resources from the Graduate Institute and the SDC, as well as the support of Edward Elgar, all of the editorial support that goes both deep and wide in the NORRAG team, and to the events team as well for putting on this very, very smooth running webinar today. And a huge thank you to our interpreters who do a terribly difficult job under trying circumstances, particularly when we're dealing with online. So thank you all very much as well. And to all of our participants, thank you for being with us today. And we look forward to hearing your feedback on the book as well. Thank you all.